he's not a glad hander. He doesn't kiss babies. When he does, he looks very awkward, and he's not very good at connecting with people in speeches. When he himself runs for office, he tends to sort of give one speech in a campaign cycle and try to allow his television and propaganda apparatus really to do the rest. So it is an unusual exercise, but I think it says something about the degree of anxiety in the Kremlin that they feel this is something they have to put him through.
The Times reports that the Kremlin is moving the last of its forces out of the Middle East to focus on the war in Ukraine. This as President Putin has been on a domestic tour of Russia to try to boost his support, and indeed support for the conflict, which is nearing its fifth year. Sam Greene is a professor of Russian politics at King's College London. Sam, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Good to speak to you. President Putin's domestic tour, first of all. It's interesting that he has to do this. Is this a kind of normal part of war, I suppose, or does he feel that support may be slipping?
Well, I think it probably has a little bit less to do with the war, actually, a little bit more to do with parliamentary elections coming up. We always have to put inverted commas around the idea of elections in a country like Russia, where, the overarching outcome is a foregone conclusion, but still he needs people, broadly speaking, to vote for his ruling party. He's allowed that ruling party to campaign with his name and likeness, which is something he's never allowed them to do before. He's tried to sort of float above politics, and he's doing this at a time when, yes, the war is coming home to people in ways it hasn't before, when cost of living is becoming much more of a problem than it has before, when we've got fuel shortages due to Ukrainian attacks on refineries, as well as other vagaries of Russian economic and market management. Life is uncomfortable for many Russians. They're taking it out on their politicians, as people do around the world, and he's finding that he's having to close some of that gap.
Yeah. It's interesting that the gap is there. I suppose, will he be successful? What's he like as a campaigner, President Putin, as somebody who tries to kind of win people's support?
It's not something he does very much, because it's not really something he does very well, right? I mean, he does carry a lot of legitimacy because he's been around for so long, and he's associated with Russia's largest increase in personal welfare, right, in prosperity, really throughout Russian history, right? So he does carry that popularity with him. He carries some popularity associated with the war, certainly the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But he's not a glad hander. He doesn't kiss babies. When he does, he looks very awkward, and he's not very good at connecting with people in speeches. When he himself runs for office, he tends to sort of give one speech in a campaign cycle and try to allow his television and propaganda apparatus really to do the rest. So it is an unusual exercise, but I think it says something about the degree of anxiety in the Kremlin that they feel this is something they have to put him through.
What then of the Middle East retreat to focus on the war in Ukraine? And is there a consideration here, Sam, about the withdrawal representing something of a diminishing global influence of Putin and Russia?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think some of this is really sort of theater specific. The reality is that there's not a lot for Russia to play for in Syria at the moment. It has a workable relationship with the new regime ever since the fall of Assad, but it's not a terribly friendly relationship. There isn't a security role for it to play, and so these are forces that are, for all intents and purposes, a waste of money. It's resource that can be better spent elsewhere, whether that's at home, bolstering the front line in Ukraine, bolstering the logistics, and really helping the Ukrainians and the Europeans possibly come to the conclusion that Russia is willing to fight on, despite the fact that it's really not making a lot of progress in that war, or potentially redeploy to other places, right? So we are seeing, after the loss of Syria, we are seeing Russia try to build new toeholds in Libya to bolster some of its positions in Africa. It is, I think, not ready to give up on the idea of a global presence quite yet.
Yeah, I noted another thing that maybe had gone slightly under the radar, that Serbia, one of the few European countries not to impose sanctions on Moscow over the invasion of Ukraine, actually welcomed President Zelensky last week for his first visit since the invasion in 2022. So there's the Middle East context. But what about this Serbian move as well? A Ukrainian official described the talks between Zelensky and the president of Serbia as a slap in the face for Putin, and as part of an effort to pull the Serbs away from the Kremlin. What's your analysis of that, Sam?
Well, certainly it will be a little bit drawing to the Kremlin, but the reality is that Serbia has walked a fairly thin line right throughout this war. It has not wanted to provoke Russia. It has tried to keep some distance between itself and European policy on sanctions in particular, but it has also supplied significant amount of armaments to the Ukrainians. It has cooperated, broadly speaking, with the West in terms of sanctions enforcement as well. Tried not to allow itself to be a channel for sanctions evasion by the Russians. It understands that on one level, its relationship with Russia is very important as a source of leverage vis-a-vis Europe. But the fundamental economic and security relationship for Serbia down the road is a relationship with Europe, not a relationship with Russia.
Yeah. And you mentioned elections in inverted commas. Our listener Michael gets in touch. Can a Russian vote against Putin? Which I like the simplicity of that question, Sam. Is that possible?
Well, first of all, it's a parliamentary election, so in theory, Putin's not on the ballot, right? There are
Fair.
various options. You can vote against United Russia. You don't have any party really on the ballot that is putting itself in opposition, broadly speaking, to his policies. Certainly not to the war. There was one party, the Yabloko party, that had promised to campaign on a platform of peace and of ending the war. It was barred from the elections in a Supreme Court decision just yesterday. So on a fundamental level, that option is not available. If you would like to see differences in socioeconomic policy and some of the ways that social welfare is managed, then you have choices. But fundamentally, no, you're not voting against Putin.
Very helpful. Sam, good to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That is Sam Greene, Professor of Russian Politics at King's College London. Lots of